Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're talking about the Bee Gees. And I want to do a little experiment. What would the legacy of the Bee Gees be if they never went disco, or maybe even if they never got so huge doing disco? Because the fact of the matter is, the Bee Gees were incredibly popular long before they ever played a note of disco style music. And their style, I would have called their pre-disco style, I'd refer to it as progressive vocal music. Some people refer to it as Baroque pop. I absolutely loathe that term, but I think progressive vocal music is really a good way to think about it. Their proper first album, which incidentally was called The Bee Gees, first came out in 1967. Now, what else was happening musically at that time? Well, there was Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues. There was Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. There was Piper at the Gates of Dawn by Pink Floyd. There were the first Pink Floyd album, for that matter. There was Jimi Hendrix in the air. There was psychedelia everywhere. And it was there was Procol Harum, A Whiter Shade of Pale in 67. And so it was within that context, that musical context, that the Bee Gees released their first album, which is one of the best progressive vocal albums ever. What an album it is. The song Holiday, one of the best songs frankly, ever of any genre. Every Christian lion-hearted man will show you full of mellotron, that great progressive rock instrument. I can't see nobody. My eyes can only look at you. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. To Love Somebody, which was covered by everyone. Eric Burden and his new version of The Animals did a wonderful cover of that. And they continued going from strength to strength on their second album, of New York Mining Disaster. Wonderful. World on Horizontal, their next album, absolutely wonderful. Massachusetts, absolutely marvelous as well. And again, the third album, Idea, in this golden era of theirs. Let There Be Love, a great song. I Started a Joke, wonderful song. And then they came out with a concept album at the end of the 60s called Odessa, which was about a shipwreck, I do believe, and it had some great stuff on there too. The title track, very interesting, Melody Fair, wonderful. And it was after that where they sort of transitioned into their second phase. Rather than go further in that progressive direction, they honed that and went in a somewhat more pop direction, but not entirely mainstream. There were still elements of the progressive stuff there. It was certainly a lot of romance. And this era was typified with the smash hit from 71 of the Trafalgar album, and this was How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? One of the best, again, one of the best songs of all time. Al Green did a great cover. Now, you're probably noticing some themes in this video, other than the fact that the Bee Gees were wonderful performers. They were great songwriters. The songs that they wrote were just excellent, and they had all of the trappings and all of the drama and tension of a lot of the progressive pop and progressive rock music. But because they were a vocal band, there was something that was hummable and singable about the music, even if the person singing it could never sing it or in a way that even approximated the way that the Bee Gees sung on their own records. And this middle period continued. Life in a Tin Can and Mr. Natural were good albums as well. But they were stuck in, pardon me, a bit of a rut. And everything changed when they entered their third phase of their adult career, which was 1975's Main Course. Now, this was really a soul album. It was an R&B album, and it eventually came to be known as a disco album. Now, what is the difference between disco, funk, soul, and R&B? Well, disco is usually a term that's applied to the lighter and whiter versions of funk. Now, all of the main soul and funk artists, most of whom were black, did at one point or another either record an album marketed as disco or one that was approximating that. But I would say that the biggest difference between funk and disco is how well it was marketed to white audiences. That's the biggest difference. There are other differences. There's that, traditional disco beat, and there's the fact that whenever a genre becomes popular, people who aren't very good musicians or producers try to get in on the craze. And so why is there a lot of bad disco music? Well, because the good disco music became so popular and everyone wanted in on it. And you can look genre after genre that happens. But Main Course was a great album, even by black soul and funk standards. It had the hit Jive Talkin', Nights on Broadway, a great song. It had a ballad, Fanny Be Tender with My Love. And this got them on the disco trip. They followed this up with Children of the World in 76, which had You Should Be Dancing, some say a quintessential disco song. And then, of course, there was Saturday Night Fever, which, it's a soundtrack, but the best-selling disco album of all time. And the Bee Gees, of course, were the featured artists there. There were other great artists too. Now, at the end of the 70s, as we all know, the Bee Gees' fortunes kind of changed, and there were two reasons for this. There was the backlash against disco by mainstream rock fans. This was typified by the Disco Sucks blowing up of records in Chicago at a Cubs game at the end of the decade. And then there was the Bee Gees' participation in the very unpopular Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band film that had nothing to do with the Beatles, no endorsement, no anything. But they continued to have success in the 80s as songwriters for other artists. Dolly Parton, Kenny Rogers, the list goes on, because they were ultimately songwriters and they were just as happy and just as successful writing for others as they were writing for themselves. But take all of this in totality. If the Bee Gees were to have either stopped in around 1973, or if they were to have not done something to really not only revive but make their careers huge, I think that they would be remembered as sort of the vocal band equivalent to Procol Harum. So while Procol Harum was this wonderful sort of proggy rock band, but centered on songwriting, really, rather than the sort of mad soloing and instrumental sections typical of bands like Yes, ELP, Genesis. They were the singer-songwriters prog rock band. And I would say that as a vocal group, a vocal trio, the Bee Gees would have been remembered like that if they never went disco. And that's not a bad thing to be remembered by. In fact, I would say it's a very good thing. They may have even survived the 80s when disco, as marketed as disco, really fell off, even though ironically the synth pop music of the 80s owes just as much to disco as to any of the more underground genres of the late 70s. So take a listen to the early Bee Gees stuff if all you know about them is from the Saturday Night Fever era. It's very different, very good, and if you're more on the rocky side and more on the progressive side, I think you'll really, really like it. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.